There are things you learn about land that nobody can teach you from a classroom or a city apartment or a courtroom chair. You learn them from your knees, pressed into soil at 6 in the morning while the dew is still cold on the grass. You learn them from a particular way a field smells after 3 weeks without rain. That dry, papery scent that tells you the ground is thirsty in a way that goes down to the bedrock. You learn them from standing at the fence line with an old man who doesn't say much, who just points at a certain patch of earth and nods, as if the two of you share a language that was never written down. My grandfather taught me that language. His name was Nora Pruitt, and in the last 4 years of his life, I was the only one who bothered to listen to him. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not a special person. I was not born with advantages. I did not have a plan. What I had at 19 years old was $43 in my wallet, a canvas backpack with 2 changes of clothes, and a letter from a probate office that had been sitting in a manila envelope at the County Youth Housing Center for 6 weeks before anyone thought to hand it to me. The letter was addressed to me, Nora Pruitt, and had been sent from a law office in Calhoun County, Tennessee. The return address was one I didn't recognize. The attorney's name was Harold Briggs. I remember standing in the parking lot of the housing center the morning I aged out of the system. The sky the color of old concrete, the wind pulling at my jacket, reading the letter twice because the first time I couldn't quite believe what it said. Your grandfather, Earl James Pruitt, has designated you as the sole heir to the following property: 45.3 acres of unimproved land located along Dry Hollow Road, Calhoun County, Tennessee, parcel number 0047. A. Due to unpaid county assessments, the parcel currently carries a delinquent tax balance of $14. Upon payment of this balance and completion of transfer paperwork, the deed will be recorded in your name. $14 for 45 acres. I read the letter a third time. The property had been assessed at almost nothing, dry clay flat land out on the eastern edge of the county, the kind of ground where nothing grew well, where the topsoil had thinned almost nothing over decades, where the creek that once ran to the southern edge had dried to a muddy trickle by the time my grandfather bought the parcel in 1989. The county called it unimproved. The neighbors called it dead ground. My grandfather called it his. He bought it when my father was still a boy, paid cash for it with money he'd saved over 20 years of working at a grain elevator in the next county over. He never built on it, never farmed it properly, at least not in ways the family could see. He would drive out there on Sundays in his old Ford pickup, sometimes taking me along when I was small, and he would walk the land in slow, deliberate circles, run his hand along the fence posts, stop in a crouch and press his palm flat against the clay. I used to think he was just being sentimental. Old men and their land. I didn't understand then what he was actually doing. My grandfather raised 4 children on that property and on the small house in town where my grandmother held everything together with canning jars and prayer and a tenacity so quiet you almost didn't notice it until she was gone. My father, Calvin Pruitt, was the second of the 4. The oldest was my Uncle Dean, who had moved to Nashville before I was born and came back only for funerals and holidays, always arriving in a clean car and leaving with opinions about what everybody else should be doing differently. There were 2 daughters, my aunts Patricia and Wren, who had both married into farming families of their own and lived within 30 miles of the county line. But it was my father who had stayed closest to my grandfather. For a while, when I was young, the 3 of us, my father, my grandfather, and I, would spend Saturday mornings out on Dry Hollow Road. My grandfather would explain things. The way clay soil compacts differently from loam. The way a property's legal description in a deed doesn't always match what you see on the ground. The way mineral surveys and soil surveys are 2 entirely different documents, and most people only ever look at one of them. I was 8 years old, and I didn't understand most of it, but I listened. I always listened to him. Then my father lost his job at the feed mill. Then he started drinking. Then, when I was 11, my mother left, and my father's grief and shame curdled into something dark and mean. By the time I was 15, home was no longer a place I could live safely. By 16, I was in the county system. My grandfather tried to help. He came to visit me twice at my first placement. The second time, he brought me a paperback book about soil science, the kind of thick, dry volume that most teenagers would have thrown in a corner, and he sat beside me on the institutional couch and told me, quietly, that the land would always be there, that the land had a memory, that what was put into the earth honestly tended to stay put. I didn't know what he meant. I thought he was just an old man with old man thoughts about a piece of clay ground that nobody in the family wanted. He died when I was 17. I didn't find out for 3 days because no one thought to call the placement home. By the time I learned he was gone, the funeral was already over. My Uncle Dean had arranged everything. Efficiently, quickly, the way Dean arranged most things. I grieved alone on a cot in a room I shared with 2 other girls I barely knew, with that old soil science book pressed against my chest, trying to remember the exact sound of my grandfather's voice when he told me the land had a memory. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know where this story finds you tonight. That morning in the parking lot, reading that letter, I was 19 years old, and I owned nothing but what I could carry. The housing center had a bus pass program for people aging out of the system, a 30-day transit card good for travel within the county. Calhoun County was about 40 miles east. I had $43 and a letter telling me I could claim 45 acres of dead clay ground for 14 of them. I want to tell you, I felt hope in that moment. The truth is messier than that. What I felt was closer to stubbornness, a kind of narrow, cold determination that came not from optimism but from the simple fact that I had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. I picked up my backpack. I walked to the bus station. The ride to Calhoun County took most of the morning. The bus was half empty, smelling of coffee and old vinyl. I sat by the window and watched the city flatten into suburbs and the suburbs thin into fields, and the fields widen and grow quieter until there was nothing outside the glass but the long, gray-green roll of Tennessee countryside in early spring, the hardwood trees still bare, the fields still pale and winter-worn. Calhoun County's seat was a small town called Greer, population 4,000 on a good day. The main street had a hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, and a county courthouse built of brick-the-color dried blood. The law office of Harold Briggs was in a narrow building beside the pharmacy, up a flight of creaking stairs, behind a door with a frosted glass window. Mr. Briggs was a thin man in his late 60s with the careful, unhurried movements of someone who had spent decades dealing with people in difficult circumstances and had learned that rushing never helped. He looked at me over his glasses when I came in, took in the backpack and the worn boots and the fact that I was clearly very young, and said nothing about any of it. He had a file folder open on the desk. He knew who I was before I introduced myself. "Your grandfather was specific," he said as he slid the paperwork across to me. "He chose you deliberately, Miss Pruitt. He left a letter of instruction that I was to give you at the time of transfer. He set this up several years before his death. He knew it would take time for the letter to reach you, and he accounted for that. I paid the $14 in crumpled bills. I signed the papers. Mr. Briggs handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it in my grandfather's handwriting and a heavy iron key on a simple ring. He also handed me something else, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map of the property. In the center of the map, in that familiar, careful script, was a single word. Underneath, I stared at it for a moment. Mr. Briggs was watching me. He told me. The attorney said quietly that you would know what that meant, or that you would figure it out. He said you were the only one who ever really listened. Section 2, the toxic figure arrives. I took the county road east out of Greer, following the hand-drawn map, walking because the bus didn't run that direction, and I couldn't afford anything else. The morning had turned gray and cold. The road narrowed as it left town, the asphalt giving way to gravel, the gravel eventually giving way to a dirt track marked by a rusted metal signpost that read dry hollow RD in faded black letters. The walk took 2 hours. My backpack grew heavier with every mile. The land on either side of the road was a particular kind of tired Tennessee countryside that had been farmed hard and then abandoned. Fields of pale, compacted clay dotted with thin stands of scrub cedar and honeysuckle thicket. The kind of ground that looked like it had given up. I had just come around a long curve in the road, and the property was coming into view, a flat, wide expanse of clay fields, 2 old fence lines still standing, a single large cedar tree at the northwest corner. When I heard the car, it was a silver SUV, clean and expensive looking, moving fast down the dirt road behind me and slowing as it pulled alongside. The window went down and my Uncle Dean leaned out. He looked exactly like I remembered him, which is to say, he looked like a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He was 54, heavy-set, with the kind of tan you get from golf courses rather than fields. He wore a collared shirt and a sport coat. Out here on a dirt road in Calhoun County, he looked like a costume. "Nora," he said. My name in his mouth sounded like an afterthought. "When did you get here?" "This morning," I said. I kept walking. He put the SUV in park and got out. "I want you to understand something about Dean Pruitt. He was not a stupid man. He was not even, in the ordinary sense, a cruel man. What he was a man who had spent his entire adult life calculating the value of things and assigning that value to his own position in the world. He had done well in Nashville in commercial real estate. He wore that success the way some men wear expensive watches, not for warmth, but to be seen. You got the letter from Briggs." He said, "It wasn't a question." "I did." He fell into step beside me. "I need you to understand the situation before you get any ideas about this property." He kept his voice pleasant, reasonable. "Dad's estate is more complicated than that letter makes it sound. There are debts. There are property assessments. There are issues with the deed description that go back 20 years. The family has been trying to sort it all out since he passed." I looked at him sideways. "What family? I didn't hear from anyone for 2 years. We didn't know how to reach you." His tone carried a practiced sympathy that didn't quite fit his face. "You were in the system. It was complicated. You had a letter at a fixed address for 6 weeks before it reached me." I said, "Someone knew where I was." He stopped walking. When he spoke again, the pleasantness had thinned slightly. "The land isn't worth anything, Nora. It never was. Dad was sentimental about it. That's all. The soil is exhausted. The water rights are disputed. And there's no road access worth calling access. My business partners and I have been in conversations with a development company called Meridian Land Holdings for the past 8 months. They want to acquire all the contiguous parcels out here for an industrial logistics facility. The county is behind it, jobs, tax base. They're willing to pay fair market value." "What's fair market value for dead ground?" I asked. He named a figure. It was enough to change someone's life if they had nothing, which he knew I did. $38,000. Split 4 ways among the heirs, himself, my father, and the 2 aunts, came to roughly $9,500 each. He was already calculating my share out of the total, as if it had already been decided, as if my $14 in Harold Briggs signed paperwork were a formality rather than a legal transfer of title. "There are 4 heirs," I said. His expression flickered. "Your father has already agreed to sign over his interest to the collective. It simplifies things with a Meridian deal." My father, whom I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, had apparently already signed something, without talking to me. Dean reached into his jacket and produced a business card. It belonged to someone named Marcus Finley at Meridian Land Holdings. Below the name, in small text, "Senior Acquisitions Director." "I'd like you to come to a family meeting," Dean said, "tomorrow evening at the farmhouse. Everyone will be there. Patricia, Ren, your dad. We can go through everything together. Make sure you understand your options." He said options the way you say options when you mean there is only one option, and it has already been decided. I took the business card. I looked at it for a moment, then tucked it into my jacket pocket. Dean watched me with the patient expression of a man who had already won an argument he hadn't yet had. Then he got back in the SUV and drove back toward town. I stood there on the dirt road for a moment, holding the iron key in my hand, looking out at the 45 acres of dead clay that now belonged to me. The cedar tree at the northwest corner stood very still in the cold air, the fence posts tilted at their gradual angles. The ground was pale and cracked and hard, but it was mine. I opened the sealed envelope for my grandfather. The letter inside was 3 pages, handwritten, in the careful script I recognized from a map. I stood on the dirt road and read it. By the time I finished, my hand was shaking, not from the cold. Section 3, the public humiliation. The Pruitt farmhouse was a 2-story white frame house in town that my grandparents had lived in for 40 years. My grandmother had been dead for a decade since my grandfather's death, It stood more or less empty, the family fighting quietly over who should make decisions about it, without anyone wanting to pay to maintain it. The living room had been arranged with chairs around the old dining table. My Uncle Dean sat at the head, which would have surprised no one. Patricia was there, a stout, practical woman in her late 40s who had always been kind to me in the distracted way of someone who had too many of her own problems. Wren sat beside her, thinner, quieter, watching everything with sharp eyes. And at the far end of the table, looking at the tabletop rather than at me, was my father. Calhoun Pruitt was 51 years old and looked older. He had a hollowed-out look of a man who had fought a long battle with himself and not clearly won or lost. He was sober, I thought, at least tonight. He didn't meet my eyes when I came in. There was also a fifth person I hadn't expected, a man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Marcus Finley from Meridian Land Holdings, the same name on Dean's business card. He had his own folder of documents and an expression of rehearsed friendliness that he deployed like a tool. I sat down. I kept my backpack on the chair beside me. Dean opened the meeting by explaining the situation as he understood it, which was to say he explained it in the way most favorable to the conclusion he had already reached. He talked about the family's shared interest in my grandfather's estate. He talked about Earl Pruitt's desire, presumably, to see the family benefit from whatever assets he left. He talked about the Meridian deal as if it were already agreed upon, using the phrase when we closed on the Dry Hollow parcel before anyone had discussed whether the parcel would be sold. Then Marcus Finley spoke. He was smooth and practiced. He used phrases like community investment and economic revitalization. He had a presentation on a laptop that showed renderings of a logistics facility. Clean, modern-looking structures on flat, well-graded ground. He talked about jobs. He said the word opportunity several times. Then he named the total acquisition price for the Dry Hollow parcel and the two adjacent parcels that Meridian had already secured. The number was large. My share, as Dean framed it, a minority interest contingent on the family's ability to present a unified title, was approximately $14,000, which was, I noticed, exactly $1,000 per acre, for 45 acres that my grandfather had carried for 35 years. Patricia asked how long the process would take. Wren asked about the tax implications. My father said nothing. He was looking at his hands. I sat quietly through all of it. I let them talk. I let Dean walk to the timeline, the documents, the projected closing date. I let Marcus Finley explain the title process. I let the meeting build toward its natural conclusion, which was that I would sign a quitclaim deed transferring my interest in the Dry Hollow parcel to the family collective so that Dean could present a clean title to Meridian. Then Dean looked at me. You've had a day to think it over. Nora, I want to make sure you feel included in this process. This is your family's decision, and you're a part of this family. He said it so warmly. You would almost not notice the word quitclaim sitting in the middle of the documents in front of me. You would almost not notice that he had already filled in the date. I appreciate that, I said. I'd like to ask a couple of questions before we talk about signing anything. He spread his hands. Of course. What date was the property transferred to my name? Dean paused. This morning, I imagine, when you signed at Briggs' office. So as of this morning, the legal owner of record for parcel 0047A in Calhoun County is me. Solely. A slight tightening around Dean's eyes. It's a little more complicated than that. The property was part of a joint estate. No, I said. I looked at Marcus Finley. Did Meridian pull the title search on parcel 0047 before today? Finley glanced at Dean. We have a title report from 6 months ago showing Earl Pruitt as a record owner with a designation for sole transfer to Nora Pruitt upon his death. I said, which happened as of this morning, which means Meridian's title report is 6 months out of date. The room was quiet for a moment. Dean's voice went careful and even. Nora, you're a 19-year-old girl who just came from a youth shelter. I understand you're trying to assert yourself here, but you don't have the legal knowledge to... I'm not asserting myself, I said. I'm reading the deed. I pulled a copy from my jacket, one I had made at the courthouse in Greer before walking out to property. And I'm asking questions because my grandfather told me to ask questions before I sign anything. He was specific about that. Something shifted at the table. Not dramatically, just a small tidal movement. The way a room's air changes when someone says something that can't be taken back. Ren was watching me with a new expression. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was assessment. Patricia said quietly, "What did Dad's letter say?" Dean said, "That's not relevant." I said, "It said quite a lot." Then I put the letter away. Not because I was done with it, because I wasn't ready yet. The letter was only the beginning of what I needed them to know. The beginning of what my grandfather had spent 35 years preparing for this exact moment. I stood up. I thanked Marcus Finley for his time. I told Dean I would need 48 hours before making any decisions about signing anything. I looked at my father once, briefly, long enough to see his hands tighten on the edge of the table, long enough to see something move behind his eyes that I couldn't quite name. Then I picked up my backpack and walked out. Behind me, I heard Dean say to someone, "She'll come around. She doesn't have anywhere else to go." He was right about one thing. I didn't have anywhere else to go. What he didn't understand was that I didn't need anywhere else to go. I had 45 acres of dead clay on Dry Hollow Road, and I was beginning to understand what was underneath it. Part 2, the masterclass revelation. Section 4, the investigation. My grandfather's letter was not sentimental. That was the first thing I understood about it. It was a letter of a man who had spent years thinking through a problem and had arrived at a solution that was meticulous and patient and legally ironclad. The sentiment was in the fact that he had done it at all. The substance was something else entirely. Let me tell you what Earl James Pruitt had done with 45 acres of dead clay ground over 35 years. In 1989, when he bought the Dry Hollow parcel, he paid cash, $3,200 for the land, which the seller considered a miracle. The soil was exhausted red clay, the kind that cracks in summer and floods in winter and grows very little in between. The previous owner had farmed it into near ruin and was glad to be rid of it. My grandfather had its soil surveyed within the year, not by the county extension office, which would have confirmed what everyone already knew, that the ground was poor. He hired an independent geologist from the state university, a man named Dr. Thomas Arvin, who was a specialist not in agriculture but in subsurface geology. The survey took 3 months. Dr. Arvin's report, a copy of which was included with my grandfather's letter, was dated June 1990. The report noted, in technical language I had to read 3 times to fully parse, that the Dry Hollow parcel sat above a significant subsurface aquifer, a deeply buried freshwater lens that had been entirely overlooked because the surface clay made the parcel look hydrologically dead. Below 18 to 22 feet of compacted clay, the geology changed entirely, dropping into a layer of fractured limestone that held more clean water than anything else in the eastern half of Calhoun County. In 1990, this was interesting but not immediately profitable. Rural Tennessee had water. You didn't sell water to farmers in a state that had rivers. But my grandfather had a longer view. In 1993, he quietly filed a water rights designation with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, registering himself as the beneficial owner of the subsurface water on parcel 0047, under the state's groundwater appropriation statute. The application was approved. Almost no one in Calhoun County knew the statute existed. Almost no one knew it was possible to separately register groundwater rights on a parcel in a riparian state like Tennessee if you had the Geological Survey to support the claim. The registration had been renewed every 5 years since. The most recent renewal was 2018, 2 years before my grandfather died. The water rights were registered in the name of the Earl J. Pruitt Family Trust, with sole beneficial interest designated to Nora and Pruitt upon Earl's death. That was not all. In 1997, my grandfather had the parcel professionally surveyed for the 3rd time. Not for water this time, but for mineral content. A soils chemist named Ruth Calloway performed an analysis of core samples taken at intervals across the property. Her report, also included in the letter package, identified elevated concentrations of lithium-bearing clay minerals in the subsurface layer just above the limestone aquifer. The concentrations were not extraordinary by industrial extraction standards, but they were consistent and geographically coherent across a large portion of the 45 acres. In 1997, lithium was a battery component of modest commercial interest. In 2024, it was one of the most sought-after minerals in North America. I sat in a diner in Greer, Tennessee, with a cup of coffee and a stack of 35-year-old documents, and I read through them for the third time. Then I looked out the window at the street. My grandfather had bought 45 acres of dead clay and spent 35 years quietly proving that it wasn't dead. It was just hidden. There was more in the letter. The word on the map, underneath, referred to something literal. In 2002, my grandfather had contracted with a small construction company out of Knoxville to excavate and pour a concrete vault beneath the clay's surface on the northeast corner of the property. The vault was 12 feet below grade, accessible by a steel ladder through a hatch he had capped and buried under 2 feet of compacted fill. He had done this over the course of a single summer, telling no one in the family what he was doing. The construction company was paid in cash and was long since dissolved. Inside the vault, his letter told me, were the original copies of every document I needed: the geological surveys, the water rights registration, the mineral assay, the deed, the trust instrument, and one more thing that I read about twice before I understood it fully. In 2019, 1 year before his death, a company called Clearwater Agricultural Resources had approached my grandfather about the Dry Hollow parcel. They were a subsidiary of a larger consortium that was quietly acquiring water-rich subsurface properties across rural Tennessee in anticipation of what their analysts were calling a long-term freshwater stress event across the Mid-South. They offered him $2.3 million for the Dry Hollow parcel and all associated water rights. My grandfather had declined, but he had kept their letter. The Meridian Land Holdings offer, the industrial logistics facility, the cleanup story, the $38,000 for the whole parcel, was not the first offer on this ground. It wasn't even in the same universe as what the ground was actually worth to someone who knew what was underneath it. Meridian Land Holdings, I discovered after 45 minutes with a laptop at the county library, was a subsidiary of the same consortium that owned Clearwater Agricultural Resources. Different brand, same parent company. They had come back with a new story, and they had found my Uncle Dean to help them tell it. I took the bus back to Dry Hollow Road that afternoon with a shovel borrowed from the diner's owner, a large, patient woman named Bet, who had seen enough of life's edges to ask very few questions of young women who looked like they were carrying something heavy. I walked the property until I found the northeast corner, marked on my grandfather's map by a fence post with a double-wrapped wire. I measured his distances carefully, and then I started to dig. The clay was hard. The first foot took an hour. The second took almost as long. My hands blistered, and my shoulders burned in the cold afternoon light dropped lower and lower over the field. I had no way of knowing for certain that the vault was real. I had only a dead man's letter and the faith of someone who had learned, once, to listen to him. At 11 feet, the shovel hit concrete. If you've ever had a moment where everything a person ever told you suddenly becomes real and true and solid under your hands, that is what that felt like. Not triumph, not even relief, just a strange, overwhelming recognition that he had been right, that the ground had a memory, that what was put into the earth honestly tended to stay put. The hatch was steel, heavy with rust, sealed with a padlock that the iron key opened on the second try. I climbed down into the dark. Section 5, the solution. The vault was the size of a large walk-in closet, lined with concrete block, dry in spite of everything, lit when I found the battery-powered lantern my grandfather had left on a small shelf just inside the hatch. The lantern still worked. He had replaced the batteries at his last visit. His letter had noted this without explanation, as if it were simply one more practical problem he had solved for. The documents were in a steel military surplus case, waterproof, sealed with a rubber gasket. Inside were 12 separate file folders, each labeled in his handwriting. I took them up the ladder one at a time and spread them on the clay above the hatch in the fading light. But the documents were not what stopped me cold. On the shelf beside the lantern was a second sealed envelope. This one was thicker, and on the front, in my grandfather's script, he had written, "For the meeting. You'll know when." I opened it. Inside was a single cover letter, a brief explanatory note in his handwriting, and attached to it was a document I had to read 3 times to understand. It was a letter of intent, executed and notarized, from Clearwater Agricultural Resources, dated 8 months after my grandfather's death. It was addressed to the Earl J. Pruitt Family Trust, meaning to me, as beneficial owner, it outlined a purchase offer of $4.1 million for the subsurface water rights alone on parcel 0047A, with the surface rights to remain with the trust. The offer was contingent on confirmation of the water rights registration. Someone at Clearwater had known my grandfather was dying. They had waited, and then they had submitted the offer to the trust. The letter had been delivered to Harold Briggs' office. Briggs had held it, per my grandfather's standing instructions, until I came to claim the deed for $0.1 million for the water rights alone, not the surface land, not the mineral rights, just the water under the dead clay. I sat down on the ground next to the open vault with that letter in my hands, and I didn't cry. Exactly. What I did was breathe very carefully for a long time, looking up at the sky over the field, watching the first faint stars appear. The cedar tree at the northwest corner was a dark shape against the pale horizon. The fence post stretched away into the dusk. The ground was cold and hard under me. My grandfather had known. He had known from the 1990 survey. He had spent 35 years protecting this ground, paying the taxes, renewing the water rights registration, maintaining the trust, preparing the vault, waiting for the right moment, which was this moment, my moment, the moment when his granddaughter, who was the only one who had ever listened, would need it most. He had not told my father. He had not told Dean. He had not told Patricia or Wren. He had watched his children grow up and make their choices and live their lives, and he had kept this secret and carried it forward the only way he knew how, by putting it in the earth, by trusting that the earth would hold it until the right person came to dig. The next morning, I called Harold Briggs. I asked him 2 questions. He confirmed both answers. Then I called the number on the Clearwater letter. Then I went to the family meeting Dean had called for that evening. Not because Dean had summoned me, but because I was ready, because the documents of my grandfather's military case and the letter of intent from Clearwater and the 48 hours I had spent reading Tennessee groundwater law in the county library had given me everything I needed. I brought it all with me to that kitchen table. If this story is moving you, hit the like button and turn on the bell so you never miss another story like this one. Dean had brought Marcus Finley again. He had also brought a lawyer, a young associate from a Nashville firm, clean suit and a briefcase, who sat at the corner of the table and looked at me the way people sometimes look at things they have underestimated. Dean opened with the assumption that I had come to agree. He said he was glad I'd had time to think things over. He pushed the quitclaim document across the table toward me. I didn't touch it. I set my grandfather's steel case on the table instead. I want to walk through something with everyone before we talk about signing, I said. Dean sighed. Nora, I opened the case and began. I started with the 1990 Geological Survey. I read the key findings aloud. The room was quiet. Marcus Finley's expression, to his credit, barely moved, but his stillness was the stillness of someone who was calculating very fast. I laid the water rights registration on the table. I explained what it was and what it meant. The Nashville lawyer leaned forward and read the document header. I watched him read the registration date. I watched him read the trust designation. Then I put the Clearwater letter of intent on the table. The number, $4.1 million, sat there in black type in the middle of the table like a stone dropped into still water. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which everyone has understood something simultaneously, and no one has yet figured out what to do about it. Dean spoke first. He said, "That can't be right." "It's a letter of intent," I said. "It's notarized and dated. You can call the number on the letterhead and confirm it. Meridian and Clearwater are the same parent company," Patricia said slowly. She was looking at the Clearwater letter. Her voice had gone flat and careful. "They are," I said. Marcus Finley's rehearsed friendliness had completely left his face. He was looking at the documents with the expression of a man doing very bad arithmetic. The Nashville lawyer said quietly, to no one in particular, "The water rights aren't part of the surface parcel in the title description." "No," I said. "They were registered separately in 1993 under the Tennessee Groundwater Appropriation Statute." They're attached to the trust, not the deed, which means a quit claim on the surface parcel wouldn't have conveyed them even if I'd signed it. I let that settle for a moment, which is to say, even if Dean had gotten my signature on that quit claim, Meridian couldn't have sold the property to the logistics company or to the parent consortium without also acquiring the water rights, which were in my name alone, and which I had just, that morning, signed a letter of intent to negotiate separately with Clearwater's legal team. The thing Dean had been trying to buy for $38,000, the unified title that would let Meridian close its acquisition, did not exist. It had never existed. The surface land and the water rights were two separate legal instruments, and I held both of them. Marcus Finley closed his laptop. He said precisely and without inflection, "We're going to need to revisit our timeline." Then he got up and left the room to make a phone call. Section 6, the breakdown. For a long moment after Finley left, no one at the table said anything. Dean was looking at the documents. He was a smart man, and smart men in difficult moments often need a period of time to reconcile what they thought they knew with what is in front of them. I watched him do this. I watched the architecture of his assumptions shift and settle and fail. Patricia spoke first. She said, "Dad knew. He knew from 1990, I said. She looked at the ceiling. Then she laughed. A short, dry sound that was entirely unhappy. 30 years. He carried this for 30 years. He wanted to make sure it went to someone who wouldn't sell it to the first person who came along with a checkbook. I said. Wren said nothing. She was looking at my grandfather's handwriting on the document labels, and her expression was something I didn't have a word for. My father had not spoken since I sat down. I looked at him now. He was still looking at his hands. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was trying not to show something on his face. Dean said, "Finally, Nora, you need to understand that this family has been managing these assets." "No," I said. I said it without heat, without anger, just clearly. You didn't know these assets existed. No one in this room knew except Grandpa, and he decided that the way he'd seen this family manage things, the way he'd watched his estate get picked through before he was in the ground, meant he didn't want anyone else's hands on this. "That's not fair," Dean said. His voice had gone rough at the edges. "We didn't know. He didn't tell you because he didn't trust you with it," I said. "I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's what the letter says, and you should know that he said it clearly." Dean Pruitt, for perhaps the first time in the 40 minutes I'd known him as an adult, had nothing to say. Patricia looked at her brother. Then she looked at me. "He left everything to you. The water rights, the mineral designation, and the beneficial interest in the trust." "Yes. What about the surface land?" "The surface land is in my name by deed. Separately." She nodded slowly. She was doing the math. Then she said, with a directness that surprised me, "What are you going to do with it?" I hadn't answered that question yet. Not fully. But I'd been turning it over since I climbed down into that vault and climbed back up into the cold evening air with my grandfather's documents in my arms. I'd been turning it over on the bus and in the diner, and lying awake in Mr. Briggs' spare room, which he'd offered me for the week with the same unhurried practicality he brought to everything. The Clearwater offer was real. For $0.1 million for the water rights alone. I could take it. I could walk out of Calhoun County with more money than my grandfather had earned in his entire working life. And no one could say I hadn't earned it just by showing up and listening when everyone else had something better to do. But I thought about what my grandfather's letter had said in its final paragraphs. He had not just left me an asset. He had left me an argument. The argument went like this. The land is not dead. The land never was. What looks exhausted on the surface has something real underneath it. And the question is not whether you sell what's underneath, but what you build toward it. He had sketched out, in those final pages, a possibility. The aquifer made the land capable of being genuinely farmed, if you drill the right wells and manage the water intelligently. The lithium-bearing clays were a separate question, one that would take more geological work and more time, but the possibility was there. And the 45 surface acres with reliable water access were not dead ground. They were ground that had been waiting. I looked at Dean. I said, "I'm not selling the water rights." He stared at me. I'm negotiating a long-term lease with Clearwater for limited commercial water extraction from the deepest part of the aquifer, with a covenant that protects the agricultural water table for surface use. My attorney is handling the terms. The lease income will fund improvements to the surface property. Dean said, "You have an attorney?" Mr. Briggs referred me to someone in Knoxville, I said. "She specializes in natural resource trust law." We spoke this morning. Dean sat back in his chair. Something went out his face that had been there since I walked in. Not anger, exactly. Something more like the particular exhaustion that comes when a person realizes they have been confidently wrong about something for a very long time. My father spoke. His voice was rough and low, like a door that hasn't been opened in a long time. He said, "Did he say anything about me?" The room went quiet. I looked at my father for a moment. Then I reached into the steel case and took out the last document, a single sealed envelope, different from the others, labeled Calvin in my grandfather's handwriting. I slid it across the table. "He asked me to give you that if you were at the table when I told everyone," I said. "He didn't tell me what it says." My father picked up the envelope. He looked at it for a long moment. His hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. Then he stood up from the table and walked out of the room. Not away, just out into the small side hallway that led to the back porch. I heard the back door open and close quietly. Patricia looked at me. Wren looked at the table. Dean looked at the window. The Nashville lawyer quietly put his documents back in his briefcase, snapped the clasp, and excused himself. Marcus Finley did not come back. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the window, the backyard of my grandparents' house was still and bare in the early spring light. My grandmother's garden beds were overgrown. The old apple tree at the back fence had not been pruned in years and had grown into a wild, reaching shape. Dean Pruitt looked at me for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The performance had come out of it. He said, "I didn't know what he'd done out there. I genuinely didn't know." "I believe you," I said. "I should have asked," he said. "Maybe," I said, "but he wouldn't have told you. He decided that a long time ago." Dean looked down at the table. I watched him carry that, and I didn't try to take it from him. Some weight you have to hold yourself. After a while, Patricia said, "What do you need from us?" That was the right question. That was the only question that mattered now. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories on screen right now.